C'est bon, on y va ? Bonjour, bienvenue à cette conférence publique. Donc, je vais introduire l'oratrice aujourd'hui, je le fais après en anglais. Donc, Patricia Joseph est donc la directrice du Seismic Research Center. On n'entend pas ? Ah bon ? Donc, Patricia Joseph est la directrice du Seismic Research Center de l'University of West Indies in Trinidad. Et donc, elle a été très impliquée depuis de très nombreuses années sur la gestion, la surveillance volcanologique dans la Caraïbe, notamment l'éruption de Soufrière Hills, d'autres périodes de réactivation dans la Caraïbe. Et puis, évidemment, en charge, responsable au moment où l'éruption de la Soufrière de Saint-Vincent a eu lieu l'année dernière. Et donc, elle va nous présenter une conférence publique. L'éruption de 2020-2021 de la Soufrière, du volcan de la Soufrière à Saint-Vincent, réponse aux transitions éruptives. So, 2020-21 eruption of La Soufrière volcano St. Vincent, responding to eruptive transition. Thank you very much, Patricia. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you everyone for the opportunity to share with you this presentation on the management, monitoring and response of the UWI Seismic Research Center to the 2020-2021 eruption of La Soufrière St. Vincent. So just a brief overview of the talk today. So I'll give a bit of a background about the Seismic Research Center, the history of the historical activity at the volcano, a timeline of the most recent eruption and a response, as well as the monitoring operations, communications, challenges, impacts, and management.
Donc, merci à tous de l'opportunité qui m'est donnée aujourd'hui de vous présenter la gestion et le suivi de la progression de la réponse du SRC, Centre de recherche sismique de l'Université des Antilles, à l'éruption de la Soufrière de Saint-Vincent. Pour ce qui est du sommaire de la présentation, vous aurez un historique, une présentation du Centre de recherche sismique de l'Université West Indies, les conditions de la conférence, une frise chronologique, les réponses du SRC à l'éruption, la surveillance, renforcement du réseau, séismologie, volume du dôme, déformation du sol, surveillance des émissions de gaz, les communications, impact et gestion.
So the Seismic Research Center, we're based in Trinidad and Tobago, but we're responsible for monitoring the English-speaking volcanic islands of the Lesser Antilles. So that would include territories of St. Kitts and Nevis all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago. We're also responsible for the management of the Montserrat Volcano Observatory. We are the primary source of information for earthquakes and volcanoes in these islands, with a network of over 60 stations in the region. We provide contributing territories and governments with maps and information on geological hazards, and we support disaster management agencies with respect to their education and outreach efforts, as well as conduct research on geological processes in the region.
Le SRC a une large mission comprenant des responsabilités en termes de surveillance, recherche, alerte et sensibilisation, enseignement post-universitaire dans les territoires des Petites Antilles de St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua and Barbuda, Montserrat, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, Grenade, Trinidad and Tobago. Nous sommes la principale source d'informations sur les tremblements de terre et les volcans dans les Caraïbes orientales anglophones, avec le plus grand réseau géophysique de 60 stations dans la région. Notre mission est de fournir aux gouvernements concernés des cartes et des informations sur les risques géologiques, soutenir les organismes de gestion des catastrophes dans leurs efforts d'éducation du public et mener des recherches sur les processus géologiques dans la région.
So this is a structure of La Soufrière volcano prior to the 2020-2021 eruption. It has the maximum basal diameter of about 12 kilometers from east to west. The present day crater is nested within a caldera that is about 1.6 kilometers wide at the rim, and within the crater there was the 1979 dome at the summit complex.
Voilà donc une coupe de la Soufrière avant la dernière éruption. Vous pouvez voir qu'il s'élève à une hauteur de 1200 mètres et un diamètre de base de 12 km d'est en ouest. Le cratère actuel est niché dans une caldeira qui mesure 1,6 km de large à son bord.
So in the last 1,000 years, this volcano has shown both explosive and effusive type eruptions. There's been a repose period between eruptions of approximately 77 to 100 years, and over time we have seen a systematic decrease in more recent times between eruptions. In terms of the composition, the magmas tend to have a narrow compositional range. It's mainly basaltic andesites, and the eruptive products have been mainly scoria-type flows with PDCs, generating PDCs with ash fallout.
Pendant les 1000 dernières années, on peut observer des périodes de repos qui durent entre 77 et 100 ans et diminuent systématiquement dans les périodes les plus récentes. Les éruptions produisent des chutes de roc de taille médium faites de lave solidifiée et produisant une nuée ardente. Elles sont donc riches en cendres et il s'agit d'éruptions caractérisées par l'interaction entre le magma d'un volcan et l'eau issue de terrains hydratés tels que les nappes phréatiques par exemple.
So with the start of the 2020-21 eruption, I think I lost my mic. No, yeah. Hearing me now? No? Okay. So prior to the start of the eruption, there was a change in seismic activity recorded in November of 2020. I'll just speak a bit louder because I don't think. Okay. In November 2020. In late December, I think it's working.
It's working? Oh, yes.
In late December of 2020, there was a hot spot detected by satellite that was centered in the dome, and a subsequent call to the public for photos by visitors who may have been on the volcano. We discovered a photograph, the first photograph of what eventually became the new dome, or the start of the eruption, was taken on the 27th of December 2020. This was by a hiker who had gone up and had not realized what he was taking a picture of. The actual visual confirmation was done, well, first of all, the regular monitoring of that hotspot on a daily basis by through NASA firms' satellite monitoring indicated that this hotspot was growing, and on the 30th of December, we had visual confirmation from the local authorities at what we call NEMO, the National Emergency Management Organization, of that first confirmation by the authorities that a dome was in fact growing, a new dome that was adjacent to the 1979 dome. The immediate consequence was a raising of the alert level to orange, and remember, we're based in Trinidad, so we immediately remobilized a team to occupy a local observatory on island. And the effusive phase spanned from the 27th of December to the 8th of April 2021.
So, pour ce qui est des événements préalables à l'éruption, on note un changement de l'activité sismique à partir du mois de novembre. Une source de chaleur est détectée par satellite Et les observations sur le terrain confirment la présence d'un nouveau dôme dont vous pouvez voir les photos. Alors, l'Université West Indies en informe le public lors d'une conférence de presse consécutive à une information au cabinet gouvernemental. La surveillance de la source de chaleur se fait par la NASA et le système FIRMS. Et le niveau d'alerte volcanique est élevé à orange. Des scientifiques arrivent à Saint-Vincent à bord d'un avion de la sécurité nationale et une première reconnaissance aérienne est effectuée. Les travaux pour renforcer la surveillance débutent à ce moment. L'alerte est portée au niveau orange et l'équipe est mobilisée à Saint-Vincent à partir du 31 décembre 2020.
So our first step once we were on island was to strengthen the monitoring network and to conduct hazard and risk assessments. This meant we were also working closely with the National Disaster Coordinator to coordinate this monitoring effort and starting to collaborate with external partners on how we can obtain more information using techniques that are outside of our capabilities, such as satellite imagery, etc. So we also started to conduct other essential fieldwork like rock and gas sampling. We provided regular advisories and briefings to a large body of decision makers, and this included both regional authorities as well as local and government. And we responded to media inquiries, and this meant that we had to develop and implement a social media program to provide public awareness and reporting on the ongoing activity.
Pour ce qui est de notre réponse à l'éruption, nous avons commencé par renforcer le réseau de surveillance et évaluation des dangers et des risques. Nous avons travaillé en étroite collaboration avec l'Organisation nationale des catastrophes pour coordonner les efforts de surveillance. Nous avons participé à des réunions publiques et virtuelles à Saint-Vincent, notamment avec les réseaux sociaux, social networks. Et d'autres travaux essentiels ont été effectués sur le terrain, tels que échantillonnage de roches, de gaz, etc. Des réunions d'information régulières se sont tenues à l'attention d'un grand nombre de décideurs, de même que nous avons répondu aux demandes des médias et développé la mise en œuvre d'un programme pour sensibiliser le public et rendre compte des activités en cours.
One thing I forgot to mention is that this was within the COVID pandemic setting, so that we could not do a lot of things in person. So we had to develop a virtual and digital products to help with the outreach.
Une chose que j'ai oublié de préciser, c'est que tout cela s'est tenu pendant le développement de la pandémie. Il nous était difficile de faire les choses en personne. Il nous a fallu développer des moyens différents en ligne et à travers les réseaux sociaux.
So, as I mentioned before, the eruption began with an effusive phase that lasted for about 3 months, and then this transitioned to an explosive phase, and that period was from the 9th to the 22nd of April. Prior to this transition, what led up to the advice that we were providing the authorities was predominated by two VT swarm activity. So we saw the first swarm between the 23rd and 25th of March, and then, and I'll get into the more details of these events later on, and then a second swarm between the 1st to the 5th of April, where we saw a rapid increase to about 50 earthquakes per hour.
Pour ce qui est des événements volcaniques tectoniques, l'activité s'est intensifiée avec un swarm, un regain d'activité du 23 au 25 mars, puis une nouvelle accélération du 1er au 5 avril avec jusqu'à 50 tremblements de terre par heure. Quant à la phase explosive, elle s'est étalée du 9 au 21 avril avec plus de 30 explosions avec nuées ardentes sur les flancs ouest du volcan. L'alerte est rabaissée au niveau orange le 6 mai 2021.
Yeah, so after the explosive phase, we returned to an alert level of orange on the 6th of May 2021.
Après la phase explosive, on revient donc à un niveau orange, le 6 mai.
So to get more, a bit more into the response. So in terms of the monitoring network, as I mentioned, the first step was to improve on the monitoring network. So by the time that the effusive eruption was ongoing, we installed 8 digital seismic stations, 6 GPS stations, 2 cameras were operating, one at the summit and one at the observatory, which was 9 kilometers away. We had an EDM measurement of the flanks in case of flank stability that was more towards the south. And there was remote sensing. As I said, we tried to utilize collaborators and external partners to obtain information via satellite imagery, both temperatures, gas, as well as just the growth of the dome, and then as well as ground deformation. And then we were physically doing gas monitoring using spectrometry and multi-gas measurements.
En termes de surveillance, il y avait 8 stations sismiques installées dans la zone rouge, 6 stations GPS de référence, 2 caméras. The cameras were
one at the summit and one at the observatory.
Et l'autre au niveau de l'observatoire. Des mesures de distance électromagnétique, de la télédétection, des relevés de gaz pour la surveillance des émissions et des spectromètres et mesures multigaz.
So as we monitored the effusive phase, which was between November of 2020 and the 8th of April 2021, we saw that steady increase in seismicity with the 2 swarm periods that I indicated before. Prior to January 17th, the activity was sparse, and then the bulk of the earthquakes that we saw were low magnitude events, and we categorized these as dome emplacement events. These were very, very small earthquakes that we attributed to the growth of the dome and the pushing of the material very, very slowly out of the conduit. So that's it for this slide.
L'activité sporadique que nous avons relevée jusqu'au 17 janvier est de notre point de vue due à la mise en place du dôme et des mouvements que ça a généré. Il s'agissait d'événements à magnitude basse observés dans une ou deux des stations, une fois de plus, à l'emplacement du dôme.
I'm sorry, I missed some information in that. The first swarm, between the 23rd and 29th of March, was shallower, a depth of 0 to 5 kilometers, and then the second swarm was deeper.
Le premier regain d'activité, le swarm, était plus superficiel et le second était plus en profondeur.
And the locations were centered under the volcano itself.
Et situé sous le volcan lui-même.
So this is when the activity changed. On the 8th of April, we started to see banded tremor, and then this tremor was 24 hours before the first explosion. They lasted in periods of 20 minutes each, with a periodicity of about 2.5 hours, and there were 7 episodes of this prior to, followed by continuous tremor. And then the tremor showed constant properties of low frequency events and an event rate. This accelerated along gliding, what's seen in the diagram here as gliding lines. Let me show you the gliding lines.
Alors il s'agit de l'activité éruptive et les tremblements de terre étaient intensifs sur 24 heures avant la première explosion. Ils duraient 20 minutes chacun avec une périodicité de 2,5 heures. Il y a eu 7 épisodes suivis de tremblements de terre permanents et les caractéristiques sont à peu près les mêmes, low frequency, fréquence basse, Et ensuite, on a une accélération de l'activité sismique, comme vous pouvez le voir sur les diagrammes, avec les lignes qui sont en couleur.
And then just after 8, on the 9th of April, the first explosion took place. We had a series of over 30 explosions, which came, were very rapid at first, and then they decayed with a broad, more time in between explosions, and then eventually the last explosion was on the 22nd of April, and then there was an abrupt end of tremor.
Alors, les explosions se sont succédées assez rapidement, et petit à petit, la distance entre chaque explosion s'est allongée jusqu'à la dernière, the last one,
Abrupt end of tremor on the 22nd of April.
avec une fin plutôt abrupte le 22 avril.
Post-eruption, we saw an overall low level of seismic activity. There was a quite rapid decline, and we are now at the background activity recorded prior to the eruption. The alert level was lowered to green on the 16th of March 2022.
Pour ce qui est d'après l'éruption, l'activité sismique à faible échelle a continué. Et l'activité de la Soufrière est désormais considérée comme étant au niveau de l'activité enregistrée avant l'éruption de 2020-2021. Le niveau d'alerte a été ramené au vert le 16 mars 2022.
So in terms of the deformation, we used 3 types of techniques: GPS, which was continuous and campaign style, INSAR, using the satellite imagery, and the EDM surveys, which I spoke about before, which was electronic distance measurements around the flanks of the volcano, particularly to the south.
Pour ce qui est des techniques de surveillance des changements, nous utilisons une campagne GPS permanente. Nous utilisons également le satellite INSAR, Synthetic Aperture Radar, et l'étude des electromagnetic distance measurement, mesure de distance au moyen d'ondes acoustiques ou électromagnétiques.
So in terms of the data, due to the timing of the Sentinel-1 overpass, the deformation that occurred between the 19th of December and the 31st of December, we weren't able to observe anything. However, I think we saw from Raphael's talk earlier today that just prior to the explosion, the extrusion in late December, there was a deformation signal observed using Sentinel data. So we only had one operational CGPS station prior to the start of the extrusion, and we did not detect any deformation prior to the start of the extrusion. However, that changed as we started improving the network.
Alors, nous n'avions détecté qu'une seule déformation qui s'est produite entre le 19 entre le 19 et le 31 décembre 2020. Et nous n'avions pas no material to detect any, pas de matériel pour détecter d'autres déformations.
Right. So we were able to install additional stations on the summit, as well as do campaign-style GPS around the volcano. But throughout the effusive phase, there was no significant deformation detected.
Après avoir installé du matériel supplémentaire, aucune autre déformation n'a pour autant été détectée.
However, with the start of the explosive phase, we saw a rapid displacement of the CGPS network around the volcano, and this displacement was consistent with depressurization of the magma reservoir. This slowed down considerably until April the 22nd, and then after that, minimal deformation has been observed since.
You need to repeat that.
You want me to repeat it?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the explosive phase showed a rapid displacement of the CGPS network after which, well, this displacement was consistent with depressurization of the magma reservoir. And then this slowed down considerably until April the 22nd, which was the last explosion, and then after that, we saw minimal deformation.
Alors, la phase explosive correspond à un déplacement rapide du système, déplacement conséquent de la dépressurisation du réservoir magmatique. Et s'est ensuite considérablement ralenti jusqu'au 22 avril, après quoi aucune déformation n'a été observée.
So with respect to the dome growth, as I mentioned before, it was first detected by the NASA firm Soufrière, with a hotspot detected on the 27th of December, followed by visual confirmation from the local unit on island. And then we monitored the changes in the dome primarily through photogrammetry from terrestrial and aerial photographs. This was supplemented by satellite imagery. And then the dome expanded in a fairly consistent rate to occupy this, what we are calling a moat area. It was literally trapped between the 1979 dome and the crater wall. And this continued up until the 8th of April.
La première détection du dôme a été effectuée par le système Fire Information for Resource Management System, FIRMS, de la NASA, avec les sources de chaleur le 27 décembre 2020. Ensuite, une confirmation visuelle a été apportée le 29 décembre 2020. Il a été surveillé principalement par photogrammétrie à partir de photographies terrestres et aériennes. Cette surveillance a été complétée par l'imagerie satellitaire, multispectrale et radar. Le dôme s'est ensuite étendu pour remplir le fossé entre le dôme de 1979 et le mur intérieur du sommet du cratère. Les dômes de 79, 2020 et 2021 sont détruits pendant la phase explosive de l'éruption.
In the 1979 and the new 2020-2021 domes were both destroyed during the explosive phase of the eruption.
Ils ont été tous les deux détruits.
In terms of the new crater morphology post-eruption, so the pictures above would show you, this is the 1979 dome. This was a satellite imagery taken on the 17th of April. This was from, you would have seen this in Raphael's presentation as well, where it showed the destruction of the two domes, and then current configuration is like this, where there is a bulge in the center, some fumarole vents within that main central area, and there's a lot of deposits from the eruption that fell back into the crater, filling the floor of the crater.
Beaucoup d'amas à l'intérieur du cratère par rapport à la dernière éruption. Vous avez donc le dôme de 1979, ensuite une image d'avril 2021 et cette espèce de grosseur à l'intérieur du centre du cratère par rapport au rebord de 2021 et de celui de 1979.
So with respect to the gas monitoring, prior to the eruption, there was only degassing of fumaroles in the dome itself, the 1979 dome. And the signature of that, as well as a hot spring or warm spring that was lower down on the flanks of the volcano, they both had a hydrothermal signature. The last measurement prior to the eruption was done in 2018. Then in February 2021, with additional measurements, we started to see inputs from a deeper magmatic signature within that hydrothermal component. But the gases continue to be hydrothermally dominated. There was no magmatic signature in the hot springs, only from the degassing of the dome. So we believe that any magmatic signature was scrubbed before there was any seepage into the hot springs. Post-eruption, the plume has now returned to a hydrothermal signature with the gas composition showing similar signatures as the pre-eruptive chemistry.
Alors, par rapport à la signature hydrothermale en 2018, en février 2021, la signature magmatique est profonde avec une composante hydrothermale. Pas de signature magmatique dans les sources chaudes en février et mars 2021. Ensuite, on ne sait pas si on a une migration ascendante vers l'épuration. Pour ce qui est de la phase après l'éruption, la composition du panache reflète une signature hydrothermale, la composition du gaz revenant lentement à sa chimie d'avant l'éruption.
So some more gas data. This is using DOAS spectrometry of SO2. So throughout the eruption, we saw the first detection of SO2 occurred on the 8th of April, just prior to the start of the eruption, and with a measurement offshore of 88 tons per day, the flux. Then during the eruption, we had a range of a low of about 232 tons per day, and that was recorded on April the 17th, with a high of 1,000. This was ground-based because, of course, we were limited by the explosions itself, as well as we had to take these measurements offshore on a boat. So during that eruption is when we depended on the satellite data and satellite SO2 measurements to indicate what the flux was.
Alors, la chimie du panache suggère une épuration continue, d'où une estimation des flux de dioxyde de soufre. Je pense que les chiffres, les données parlent d'elles-mêmes. La chimie du panache est principalement dominée par l'hydrothermie. Post-éruption, le système hydrothermal est toujours intact.
So we are now not seeing any SO2. There's no SO2 anymore in the emissions from what's left. So it's now returned to the pre-eruption chemistry in terms of the degassing composition.
Il n'y a plus de dioxyde de soufre dans les émissions. So on imagine on pense que c'est retourné au niveau précédent l'éruption, avant éruption.
So in terms of the chemistry of the petrology of the eruptive products, as I mentioned before, the explosive products from La Soufrière tend to occupy a very narrow range in composition. So sampling of the 2021 dome, this was the composition of materials there, and the explosive products here, so they fell within that andesitic composition from historical eruptions of this volcano. So there was no significant change in the chemistry of the magma, on the composition of the magma, sorry.
La composition des matériaux est assez limitée. Il n'y a pas eu de changement significatif dans leur composition.
So we're moving into more the risk communication and social side of things. So the risk communication objectives were to reinforce the capacity of the local authorities to communicate effectively with the public. Remember, I mentioned we were dealing with a COVID environment. To be recognized during this period as one of the two primary sources of credible, accessible, and reliable information. This one source, of course, was us. The other source was the National Disaster Coordinator Office. And to facilitate the public understanding of the science related to the ongoing volcano monitoring techniques, the activity itself, and the potential hazards and hazard mitigation measures.
Pour ce qui est des objectifs de communication des risques, en gardant à l'esprit qu'on travaillait dans un contexte COVID, il s'agissait de renforcer la capacité des autorités locales à communiquer efficacement avec le public, être reconnu comme l'une des deux principales sources d'informations crédibles, accessibles et fiables sur l'activité volcanique, et faciliter la compréhension par le public de la science liée aux techniques de surveillance continue des volcans, à l'activité volcanique, aux risques potentiels et aux mesures d'atténuation des risques.
Mm-hmm. So to reinforce the capacity of the local authorities, there were several things that we tried to do, which was to establish a positive relationship or to use that relationship that we had developed over years of active engagement with both the disaster coordinator as well as the public, to provide regular scientific updates, to involve the use of trusted scientists, because most people would have been following, people who would have been following this eruption would have known that one of the team leads, Professor Robertson, Richard Robertson, he was Vincentian. He had done a lot of work with St. Vincent and communities, and he would have developed that trust and recognition with them. So we utilized our relationship with the public and the fact that we had a Vincentian scientist as part of the main monitoring team. We made sure that our communication strategies aligned with the local authorities. We had an access to a rich resource of accurate communication products that was developed specifically for this eruption, and we had regular consultations between the two agencies amongst the communication personnel.
L'avantage que nous avions pour renforcer la capacité des autorités locales à communiquer de façon efficace était la présence du professeur Richard Robertson, qui est de Saint-Vincent, donc qui a contribué à établir une relation de confiance avec le public, une relation positive établie au fil d'années d'engagement actif. Les données scientifiques étaient mises à jour régulièrement. Les communications étaient alignées de telle sorte que le public soit bien informé. Et il y avait aussi un accès à une source riche de produits de communication précis et qui correspondaient à la situation. Également une consultation régulière entre le personnel de communication du Scientific Research, NEMO.
So some of the public recognition as a primary source of information, in order to do this, within the agency, we identified eruption spokespersons, and by this I mean, we tried to, for instance, the team leads on island, they were the ones who were mainly the ones speaking to, and of course in Trinidad myself, were the main ones speaking to the media. So we knew what each other, we had the same lines of communication, so there was no misunderstanding and cross-information there. We had to raise the visibility of each of the scientific team leads through this mechanism. The scientists were living within the communities in which we were monitoring. So the Belmont Observatory was within the border of the red and orange zones. So they were seeing us in the same locations as they were. So there was that fear that we weren't in the same, we were putting ourselves at the same risks, so to speak, as the people we were trying to communicate with. So they were, they knew that, or they felt a sense of the information that we were providing was trustworthy, and they could understand where we were speaking from. We had a consistent campaign of timely updates on the activity. There was swift response to queries and rumors. We had branded communication products to ensure that they knew that this information was coming from us or NEMO, and there was consistent messaging on official information sources.
Pour nous assurer la reconnaissance du public en tant que source d'information primaire, nous avons établi des porte-paroles d'éruptions, et ce qui a contribué à instaurer la confiance, c'est le fait que nous étions sur place avec eux et qu'ils nous voyaient vivre les mêmes choses qu'ils vivaient quasiment, de telle sorte que notre visibilité était accrue. Les scientifiques et la population vivaient ensemble, vivaient les mêmes choses. Nous avons établi des campagnes cohérentes de mise à jour précises et opportunes sur l'activité volcanique, les techniques de surveillance et les risques potentiels. Les réponses aux questions et aux rumeurs, de même qu'aux situations, étaient rapides, et les messages cohérents, de même que nous avions notre logo en quelque sorte sur les produits, sur nous, de telle sorte que nous étions reconnaissables par tous.
And the last part of our strategy involved facilitating public understanding of the science. So this meant we had to produce a variety of multimedia products with accessible language, that was to minimize the scientific jargon that can often be confused. And this used audience-centric tools. We had virtual community meetings, which was simulcasted on the radio and the television. We had shareable communication products suitable for WhatsApp, because what we found was that in the red and orange zones, their primary use of sharing information amongst themselves was via WhatsApp. So when this was realized, I had to convert my advisories, my daily updates, as voice notes. And then this would be shared, and this was how it was circulated. And because of the COVID, we had to adapt some of the community meetings that was planned as drive-through meetings. So we drove through the community using bullhorns, the speakers, and this was one of the ways in which we communicated.
Alors, pour faciliter la compréhension de la science par le public, nous nous sommes adaptés. Nous nous sommes rendus compte que quand on était dans les zones rouges et oranges, le principal moyen de communication était WhatsApp. So, il a fallu que j'adapte mes communications à l'outil WhatsApp. De même que, comme on était une fois de plus en période Covid, il était difficile d'avoir des réunions sur place. Donc, on a mis en place des drive-through meetings. On conduisait on se déplaçait à travers les communautés avec des haut-parleurs pour communiquer avec eux. Les réunions communautaires virtuelles étaient aussi diffusées en simultané à la télévision et sur la radio locale. Et nous avons tâché de rendre le langage scientifique, qui peut être parfois abscon, aussi accessible que possible.
Mm-hmm. Now, these were not without some challenges and, of course, lessons learned. So with respect to the communication strategy, what we discovered was that there was obviously an absence of documented communication plan prior to the eruption. Because this eruption started effusively, most of our products were geared towards an explosive eruption. So not knowing how long the effusive phase would last, and having to deal with this situation with the growing challenge, the dome growing in the crater, we had to create new products, reaching communities on the flanks of the volcano within the context of a pandemic. With the core education and outreach team were based in Trinidad and not in St. Vincent. So it required use of the scientific team to do quite a lot of work in addition to the monitoring, and then for us to do things virtually and develop these products that could be shared.
L'équipe étant basée à Trinidad, il nous a fallu nous adapter et développer nos moyens de communiquer. Il n'y avait pas de plan de communication documenté, parce que nous avons été pris au dépourvu par le type d'éruption. Il était difficile d'atteindre les communautés situées sur les flancs du volcan par rapport, une fois de plus, au contexte de la pandémie. Il n'y avait pas d'équipe sur place, comme je l'ai dit. Et nous avons dû mettre à jour un langage cohérent qui nous permettait de varier les formats de communication.
And in terms of the lessons learned, we realized that consistent, timely updates using simple language worked best. The products that we were using needed to be audience-centric, and this helped to build trust, and that the relationship with the local authorities and the public were important with respect to crisis communications, in terms of their understanding when we were leading up to that red, the alert level changing to red, and them understanding when that happened, then we needed the local citizens to heed the evacuation warnings.
Il était nécessaire pour nous d'axer notre communication sur le public. Par exemple, quand on passait en zone rouge, il fallait qu'on explique pourquoi, sachant qu'il y avait des évacuations à la clé. Les relations avec les autorités locales et le public ont été un élément important de la communication en temps de crise.
Mm-hmm. So on the operational side, some of the challenges there was, of course, a resource-constrained environment. I mentioned that we started with one station and had to rapidly deploy a network of both ground affirmation and seismic stations while the dome was actively growing. We had, of course, the COVID-19, which limited our maintenance schedule prior to the start of the eruption, and as well as the activities during the entire phase of the eruption. We had and this may have influenced perception of the eruption by certain members of the public in terms of, because that effusive phase, the danger was considered to be only within the crater, and it did not indicate that the citizens were at risk. Some people may not have paid as much attention to the fact that it was an eruption, and there were hazards associated with it, and that the uncertainty of this moving from effusive to explosive was something to consider. There was an increasing physical risk to staff, because any work being done at the summit, we had to physically get there, which required hiking up 3 hours, possibly 4, depending on, and spending a long time on the crater rim to take these physical measurements with the uncertainty of activity at the top. Of course, resource mobilization, the way in which we're funded, led to some serious financial constraints, and this required us to lean on partners such as USGS, VDAP, etc., and then to be able to utilize equipment from other islands, designated to other islands, to relocate to St. Vincent to allow that rapid increase in the network.
Alors, les challenges étaient les ressources limitées. Souvenez-vous que je vous ai dit qu'au début, nous n'avions qu'une seule station. Bien entendu, le contexte COVID. La perception de l'éruption, comme on est passé d'une phase effusive à une phase explosive, peut-être une partie du public a-t-elle considéré que le danger était limité au cratère. Il fallait que les scientifiques, ceux qui étaient présents, se déplacent jusqu'au bord du cratère pour faire des relevés, ce qui impliquait une augmentation du risque physique pour le personnel. La préparation individuelle n'était peut-être pas tout à fait complète. Il a fallu mobiliser des ressources qui étaient destinées à d'autres îles pour notre travail d'étude et pouvoir communiquer et faire face, bien entendu, à des changements rapides en termes d'activité volcanique avec ce dôme qui changeait.
And the last point was the possibility of a rapid change in volcanic activity.
La possibilité de changement rapide de l'activité volcanique.
So I'll get into some of the impacts. So following the eruption, we know that natural hazards account for an average of 20% GDP growth in the Eastern Caribbean. So for this particular eruption, we saw over 30 explosive eruptions. There was a disruption to the water supply and other utilities. We saw 4,800 people living in emergency shelters, with 24,000 persons being displaced. This meant that many had to go to neighboring islands, or there were cruise ships that agreed to take on displaced individuals. There were 68 homes permanently damaged, and they cannot be rebuilt in their original location. The most impacted community was Sandy Bay, and post-eruption there was no access for several weeks. Other areas affected were areas on the west, were Richmond and Laracay. Sorry, on the east was on the west, yes, I was correct. West, Richmond, Laracay, and Walibu. There was a 1.2 million feeding budget for persons living in shelters, and a massive cleanup operation that was estimated to be over 28 million EC, and there were millions of dollars lost in the agricultural sector.
Pour ce qui est des impacts, il faut savoir que les catastrophes consécutives à des risques naturels sont responsables en moyenne de près de 20% de la variation de la croissance du PIB réel dans les Caraïbes orientales. Nous avons eu affaire à plus de 30 éruptions explosives, perturbations dans la distribution de l'eau, dans le déplacement des populations. Des navires de croisière ont accepté de prendre à leur bord des personnes qui ont dû être déplacées de chez elles. 4800 personnes ont été accueillies dans des abris d'urgence. 88 abris ont dû être évacués par la suite. 24 000 personnes ont été déplacées. 68 maisons ont été endommagées et pour certaines impossibles à reconstruire à leur emplacement d'origine. La communauté la plus touchée a été Sandy Bay, à laquelle on n'a pas eu accès pendant 2 semaines. Les autres zones étant à l'ouest, Richmond, Larraquin et Wallabo, et un budget d'alimentation de 1,2 million d'euros. Euros?
It was 1.2 million
US dollars. Et des opérations massives de nettoyage pour plus de 28 millions.
So, in terms of the most impacting products or effects of the hazards of the eruption, we had ashfall, which, as you can see, coated the entire island. Well, of course, there were zones of ash from heavy in the north going to moderate to the south. However, the entire island was covered in ash, and the ash even got as far as Guadeloupe, with the neighboring Barbados to the southwest of St. Vincent also being heavily impacted by the ash. So you would see, its effect on the vegetation here, as well as the valleys and slopes, as well as the houses.
Comme vous le voyez, il y a eu des retombées de cendres importantes dans les vallées, sur les affluents de montagnes. Sur la carte, vous voyez qu'il y avait des zones de retombées de cendres qui vont de très importantes jusqu'à modérées légères, sachant que la Guadeloupe a été affectée également. Les cendres étant le risque volcanique le plus fréquent et souvent et le plus répandu. Et elle constitue une menace pour la santé publique et bien entendu perturbe les services d'infrastructure.
And as we all know, of course, the ash poses a threat to public health, disruption in critical infrastructure, aviation, the societal impacts and cost, and even at a thickness of only a few millimeters.
Même quelques millimètres de cendres ont des répercussions extraordinaires en termes d'aviation, les coûts sociétaux également importants, même à partir de quelques millimètres.
So another hazard was the pyroclastic density currents that were mainly generated on the west, valleys in the west. These flows met the sea in several of the valleys to the west of the volcano, including what we see here is Larraquin and Wallabo. And there were at first a concern over tsunami generation, but fortunately that the flows weren't dense enough to create any tsunamis.
Le nuage pyroclastique, la nuée ardente que vous voyez ici rejoindre la mer, était située notamment à l'ouest de l'île.
Then, of course, the secondary hazard of mud flows, with all of the material deposited by the volcano. There was intense rainfall. Even in this picture, you can see with the flows, the level at which these flows reached using the houses here and the staining on the walls. And these were concentrated in the same, all the river valleys, particularly those in Sandy Bay on the east, and the destruction that it did to the houses were mainly in that area.
Alors, les coulées de boue étaient, elles, localisées surtout à l'est, vers Sandy Bay, et vous pouvez voir les effets sur les images ici.
So in terms of management, we predominantly used the integrated hazard map. This hazard map was created using historical information from historical eruptions in terms of the types of products that was generated by this volcano, as well as field work done in terms of measuring the geology and the different types of products across the island, or understanding of the intensities of the historical eruption. So we had, of course, the red zone, which would have been the ones mostly impacted by very high hazard, the orange zone, the yellow, and the green. We used this alongside the volcanic alert level table, which indicated the changes in alert level, the symptoms that are associated with the volcano, the actions that we take as scientists during these different periods of alert, and the recommended action by the civil authorities.
Alors, ce tableau d'alerte volcanique a été mis en place par rapport à l'historique des différentes éruptions. Vous avez différents niveaux d'alerte et différentes zones sur l'île elle-même. Donc, les niveaux d'alerte vont de vert à rouge, avec en outre donné les symptômes, les actions scientifiques et les actions recommandées aux autorités civiles pour le public.
And one of the things, I think earlier, there was a question about volcano-ready communities. So fortunately, and I think this is predominantly the work of Professor Robertson, as of Ascension, understanding, his fellow countrymen, and seeing the need over time as a scientist and a former director at Seismic, the need for to reduce the vulnerability to multi-hazard environment around La Soufrière. There was a project that was put in place. It started in November of 2018. It actually ended, it says here June 2020, but that was a targeted end date, but it actually extended until into the eruption, where they targeted 20 communities around the flanks of the volcano, particularly in the red and the orange zones. And they did a lot of community emergency response plans, protocols and simulations for evacuation, CERT training. The warehouses in these areas were stocked with essential response equipment, tools and supplies. There was a targeted community awareness campaign and capacity building training for community volunteers. And through this project, we believe that this was one of the primary ways in which when the advice or by the authorities to evacuate was given, they heeded the authorities, and because of the work done through this program, and as well as the ongoing communication and relationship we have with communities in St. Vincent, that we were able to get people to evacuate when that order was given, and unfortunately there was no loss of life.
Grâce à l'implication du professeur Robertson, qui est de Saint-Vincent, nous avons mis en place un projet qui a commencé en novembre 2018 et qui s'est normalement terminé en juin 2020, mais qui continue encore. Il s'agit de réduire la vulnérabilité à l'environnement multirisque du volcan de la Soufrière. C'est un projet qui s'adresse aux communautés qui sont sur place pour permettre de faire face en cas d'éruption, améliorer les procédures d'intervention d'urgence propres à la communauté pour pouvoir planifier, préparer et répondre aux urgences dues aux risques volcaniques et autres. Alors, il y a eu l'élaboration d'un cadre de préparation au volcan, à l'éruption, y compris des cartes de risque. 4 plans communautaires d'intervention d'urgence ont été mis en place, élaborés pour les évaluations de vulnérabilité et de capacité. 12 équipes ont été formées et équipées dans les communautés pour ce projet. 12 entrepôts d'urgence communautaires sont approvisionnés en équipements, outils et fournitures de réponse essentielles, et des campagnes de sensibilisation ont été menées de telle sorte qu'on n'a pas eu à déplorer de victimes pendant la dernière éruption.
And just to wrap up, with respect to the response by the civil authorities, the coordinating agency on island was NEMO, the National Emergency Management Organization, and the first thing they did was to establish an NEOC, And the NEOC was responsible for transportation, maintenance, assisting us with maintenance of stations, the actual evacuation, shelter operations, the call centers, the local call center that is, and a free feeding program.
Alors, NEMO, la National Emergency Management Organization, s'est mobilisée tout de suite et a mis en place NEOC, National Emergency Operations Command, qui a été responsable des transports, de la maintenance, de l'évacuation, des mises à l'abri, de mise sur pied de centres d'appel, de même que l'alimentation des populations.
And in terms of what, oops, sorry, what's next? I think I lost a slide. There we go. So in terms of consideration for the future, of course, we're still investigating the products of this eruption, as well as the scientific information that was obtained throughout to understand the processes and what triggered this eruption. There is constant LAHAR monitoring and, mapping and modeling, because as everyone knows, LAHAR is an ongoing problem, and even post-eruption. We are doing risk perception studies to help understand the response of the public and to the communication strategies that were employed during the eruption, and we are doing that through communication evaluation.
Alors, toutes les données que nous avons rassemblées, nous les exploitons de telle sorte que nous puissions comprendre ce qui s'est passé pendant cette éruption, analyser l'éruption. Nous procédons à une cartographie et une modélisation des LAHARs, des coulées de boue, des études sur la perception des risques et une évaluation de la communication.
So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Merci pour votre attention.
Do you have some question? Yeah? Yeah, you can.
Hi, I'm Charles-François Augrin. Thank you for sharing your difficult experience. I would like to know, when did you switch to red alert?
Yes, good question.
Viewers, la question est de savoir quand on est passé au stade rouge de l'alerte.
So very early on the morning of the 8th,
Très tôt le matin
just
du
after
8.
6, we met with the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and communicated to him the change in the increase in seismicity that we were seeing and the type of seismicity that we were seeing. And within hours of that, he declared the change to red alert, and gave the evacuation order.
Nous avons rencontré le Premier ministre dès 6 heures du matin et lui avons indiqué les changements que nous avons notés, et à partir de cela, il a donné l'autorisation de passer en alerte rouge.
I do have to say that the reason why that 24-hour window is used is because through our work on island, we know that that's the time that they need in order to get their transportation and everything, all the what do you call it, the volcano emergency plan in place in order to evacuate the people in the red and orange zone. So that's the time that they need in order to allow that process to happen. So that's why we need to at least give them 24 hours.
Il nous faut tâcher de leur donner 24 heures minimum, de telle sorte qu'ils puissent mettre en place tout ce dont ils ont besoin pour procéder à l'évacuation des populations.
Yes, thank you. I would like also to know, after the last explosion, how long did it take for the air to be ash-free?
So, ash-free.
Combien de temps après la dernière explosion avant que l'air ne soit purifié de toutes les cendres?
So ash-free was difficult because the density of ash in the red and orange zone was, of course, different from the yellow and the green. So it was within maybe a week in the yellow and green zones, they were virtually ash-free because we also had rain, which helped. But in the orange and red zones, however, it took months. In the air, it kept being remobilized because of winds and transportation, vehicles passing and so on. So ash-free, it took months.
Alors pour les zones jaunes et vertes, il a fallu à peu près a week, une semaine, parce qu'elles étaient bien entendu moins affectées, et puis qu'il a plu également, ce qui a aidé. En revanche, pour les zones orange et rouge, il a fallu beaucoup plus longtemps.
Given the size of the explosive phase, isn't that surprising that the hydrothermal system seems to be the same?
La taille, quant à la taille de la phase explosive, la question concerne la taille de la phase explosive.
Yeah, so this is something that we're trying to understand with respect to the ability of this volcano to seal the gases within the conduit so that it is not reflected in the hydrothermal springs. Then it went straight from there was this rapid change from the effusive to the explosive, and literally we believe that the plug that kept the fresh, the volatiles from being emitted throughout the effusive phase, that kind of was trapped within. It trapped the gases within the conduit, which led to those high volumes of SO2 when it was eventually displaced. So based on the satellite imaging, you would see that, of course, there was a lot of SO2 that was being pulsed out by these rapid explosions. So it just sealed, in some manner, the SO2, and it was not being seen in any of the gases that were emitted during the effusive phase.
Alors, on a l'impression que le volcan avait la capacité de sceller, de garder le dioxyde de soufre, de telle sorte qu'on ne le retrouvait pas dans les projections. You need to repeat the second part. It was sealed.
Yes.
And then
once the plug, that plug was released.
Une fois que ce bouchon, en quelque sorte, a été enlevé,
it allowed the gas that was trapped to
permis au gaz qui était emprisonné, fait de dioxyde de soufre, de sortir.
Did you believe at that time that the eruption could last several years, just like it did in Montserrat?
Avez-vous pensé à un moment que l'éruption allait durer plusieurs années, comme ça a été le cas à Montserrat?
No, I don't think this was ever something that we believed based on the pattern of historical activity at La Soufrière. It was always a very, once the eruption had started, the explosive eruption, that usually only lasts a few weeks before activity declines at La Soufrière. So there was never really a concern that it would last for years like Soufrière Hills. It's a very different type of pattern of behavior from historical activity. Where the uncertainty came was with respect to how long the effusive period will last, and the signals between the transition between the effusive to the explosive could be understood in time to provide the warning necessary to the public.
Alors, si on se base sur les données historiques, on n'a pas pensé que ça allait durer plusieurs années. La question était la durée entre la phase effusive et la phase explosive. Mais historiquement, les éruptions n'ont jamais duré aussi longtemps que cela.
Thank you. Yeah, I was interested to know how you think people process the joint risks of COVID as opposed to the volcano. Maybe on the one hand, on the level of political leaders, but also the public. So you've got this one thing going on, and now did they perceive the volcanic risk as being much greater, or would the fact that they would be evacuated into centres mean they'd be worried about catching COVID or something? How did they process those two very different risks at the same time?
Comment le public a-t-il analysé ces deux types de risques qui leur arrivaient en même temps, en l'occurrence la COVID et l'éruption?
So that's a very good question. And it really was a complicated situation in that knowing that we had to try to balance that situation, because when you evacuate people, you're going to shared locations where unfortunately the vaccination rates on St. Vincent was quite low. So balancing that risk became a real important consideration with respect to how we were communicating with NEMO and allowing for this time to happen. It really affected the way in which NEMO planned the evacuation, because prior to the eruption, the explosive transition, there was a lot of negotiation with the governments of neighboring islands to house people, to get those ships on, so that families could be housed together in individual cabins rather than sharing, an open space in a shelter. There were hotels in neighboring islands that were used for evacuees. That was isolated from the rest of the population, particularly if some islands took only vaccinated persons. So there was a lot of consideration. Most of the people who remained on island were likely unvaccinated, and they would have kept them in families together as much as possible to try to limit spread. So it really was kind of a complicated situation.
Alors, la situation était compliquée par rapport aux différentes zones de vaccination, par rapport aux communications avec NEMO. Et bien sûr, la pandémie a affecté les évacuations effectuées par NEMO. Pendant la phase explosive, on a procédé à des négociations avec les îles voisines de telle sorte qu'elles acceptent d'accueillir des réfugiés dans des hôtels. Mais ces réfugiés, par rapport à la situation Covid, étaient isolés du reste de la population. Et on doit dire que seulement les vaccinés ont été acceptés par les îles voisines. Les personnes qui n'étaient pas vaccinées ont tâché d'être accueillies par des personnes sur place. En tout cas, ça a été assez délicat.
What were the tipping points in people's perception that the effusive activity could transition to an explosive activity in a short time frame?
Quel a été le moment où la population s'est dit que la phase effusive pouvait passer à une phase explosive?
So I think what was the second VT swarm, when we started to see that rapid increase in the number of earthquakes, 50 per hour, and then the tremor activity, that really prompted us to kind of boost the preparedness of both the authorities to start, giving the messages, and for us ourselves to be giving the messages that, okay, there is a change in activity, and the sense to get ready for a warning to evacuate. So, and that happened between the 1st and the 5th. And then on the 8th, they started to see incandescence of the globe, and that was the first time the dome went through a period of very rapid, that was when the plug the gases that were coming up, mostly SO2, would have reached a stage where it had gotten, it had depressurized to the state where it got the plug, the cap, moving and being extruded at a faster rate. And then people started to see dome glow from the observatory and the surrounding communities, and that certainly made, when the evacuation order was given, they realized that, well, yes.
Alors c'est à partir du second regain d'activité, de second swam, second essaim, où on a vu une activité, une augmentation rapide de l'activité avec les tremblements qui se sont accélérés. Et c'est à ce moment que les autorités ont été un peu mises à... On a mis à l'œuvre les autorités pour ce qui est des procédures d'évacuation. À partir du 4 et du 5 jusqu'au 8, la phase incandescente a commencé avec cette plaque, ce bouchon qui a explosé, et les gaz ont été dépressurisés et on pouvait à ce moment voir le dôme depuis l'observatoire.
Is any temperature measurement that can be associated with gas chemistry? I ask you this because if scrubbing was going on, and that was evident, the driving factor should be temperature decrease or at least some temperature fluctuations.
Temperature measurement associated with? Les températures associées à la composition du gaz.
So unfortunately,
est-ce qu'on a pu mesurer les températures, avoir une indication des températures?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the gas measurements were being done at the summit on the crater rim. And we did not see, we weren't able to, because up there it's very, very windy, and it's a very narrow rim. Sometimes the windy and rainy, and certain measurements are not possible. So unfortunately, the only temperature measurements that we got close to was when, in the very early stages of the extrusion, they got into the crater and measured the temperature of the domes on the fringes. Other than that, we couldn't get any temperature measurements of the gas.
C'est difficile parce que les températures se prennent au niveau du sommet et que il n'est pas possible d'accéder à ce niveau. C'est très ventilé, très étroit, et que seulement on a pu atteindre ce niveau seulement dans les phases au début de l'éruption, mais pas par la suite.
Communication with the communities was very important. La communication avec les communautés était très importante. What was the average ratio between scientists monitoring and the scientists involved in the communication? Quel était le ratio entre les scientifiques qui faisaient la surveillance et ceux qui communiquaient?
So the scientific staff actually liaise very closely with the communication staff in preparing the products. So while we would not necessarily pass the communication stuff through the local team on island, we would then utilize the other scientists, based in Trinidad or Montserrat at the time to help. And if they required, advice from the team on island involved in the actual monitoring, then they would do so prior to the creation of the product, so to speak. So there was always communication between the scientists and the education and outreach team to make sure that the accuracy of the information that was being shared.
L'équipe scientifique travaille de façon très rapprochée avec l'équipe de communication. On faisait parfois appel aux équipes à Trinidad et à Montserrat, de telle sorte que les informations soient aussi précises que possible.
All right, well, thank you, everyone.
Oui, donc juste un dernier mot. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence et toutes les questions. Et merci à Patricia pour cette excellente présentation, pour une réponse à une crise exemplaire qui a été reconnue par toute la communauté, la société et les scientifiques. Et puis merci à Madame la traductrice pour votre prestation impressionnante. Merci.
Yeah, thank you, and see you tomorrow for the next part.